Go ahead and find your way with me to Exodus chapter 1. We're going to look at the book of Exodus beginning this morning, talking about when God shows up. And this is a wonderful book to describe the events that took place in the life of the Israelites as well. So go ahead and find your way with me to the book of Exodus, chapter number 1. Last weekend, my 7-year-old Knox and Ames, my 4-year-old and I, we were all running around. And that morning began in a very interesting morning, typical Sunday morning. Wake up. You get ready, and Knox was kind of a little bit distant that day just from me as far as his attitude goes. So Knox is getting ready, and he's putting his clothes on, notices he doesn't have any socks, and so he walks into the laundry room, and I'm in the laundry room right at that moment as well, and the laundry is kind of on top of the dryer and the washer. I don't know if you ever put your laundry on top of the dryer, but I have that problem. So the laundry's on top of the dryer, and Knox walks in, and he sees his socks on top of the dryer, and I say, "Knox, do you want me to hand these to you?" And Knox looks at me, and he says, "I don't need your help." I say, "Okay, 7 years old, it's fine." So he goes into the garage, and he gets the stepladder, and takes the stepladder in the laundry room, climbs up on top of the stepladder, and he gets his socks. So he doesn't need my help. That's fine. So we're going on through the day, and Knox has got ready. He walks downstairs. I'm downstairs as well, and I look at Knox and I say, "Hey, Knox, you want a glass of milk in the morning? I'll pour you a glass right now." We have a refrigerator downstairs right now in the basement. We don't have a kitchen right now upstairs, but we do have a refrigerator downstairs. That kitchen's going to come sometime in the next 10 years, and it's going to be the most beautiful kitchen you've ever seen. Actually, I'm thinking that if we do it 2 or 3 years from now, then it'll be more up to date. 5 or 6 years from now, you kind of knows how that works. So he's coming downstairs, and I say, "Knox, do you want a glass of milk?" And he says, "I don't need your help." And so he takes the milk and he pours it himself. So we go on through the day. We're walking outside. And whenever we go anywhere, Knox usually wants to take his stuff with him. And so he has, we're going to the car to get in the car to come to church. So he has his iPad. He has like a dinosaur with him. He has a bicycle with him. And he has no, he didn't have the bicycle. But he has all these things with him. And so he walks up to the car door, and I say, "Hey, Knox, let me get that door for you." And he says, "I don't need your help." I say, "Okay, fine. You can open the door yourself and get into the car." So he traveled to church, come to church, have a great Sunday morning last week. After the church service is over, we do a few more events. And then Ames and Knox and I, eventually we're going, and it's coming to the point of dinner time. And we're at the point of dinner time on later day. I think we went to lunch somewhere else, and then on later in the dinner time. And all this is, the rest of the day was the same thing. I mean, I wasn't gaining any ground with this guy. Every time I asked him for anything, he goes, "I don't need any of your help." And I thought, well, this has got to stop. So we're at the register, and we're ordering our dinner. I say, "Knox, what do you want?" This lady looks at him and says, "What would you like?" And I say, "Well, he wants," and he interrupts me. He says, "Dad, I don't need your help. I can order myself." I say, "Okay." Knox says, "I want a pizza and a bag of Cheetos." Sounds like a great meal, doesn't it? I want some pizza, and I want a bag of Cheetos, and I want root beer to drink. And so he orders his food, and the lady rings his food up, rings Amos's food up, says it's going to be $12.37. And I look at Knox and I say, "Knox, this lady wants $12.37. And Knox looks at me. And I say, "Knox, this lady, she wants $12. You want the pizza and you want the Cheetos. This lady, she wants $12.37. And Knox looks at me funny. He says, Knox says, "Can you pay for it?" I say, "Knox," I said, "when I asked you if you wanted your socks, you said you don't need my help. When I asked you if you wanted me to open the car door, you said you don't need my help. When I asked you if you wanted some milk, you said you didn't need my help. When I asked you all these questions, you said, you don't need my help, and she wants $12.37, and from the way it looks, buddy, you don't need my help for any of this stuff, you can figure out a way to pay for this." And he looks at me, and he pauses, and he says, "Dad, can you give me your help, or can you help me out for a minute?" Well, Exodus is an interesting story because God gets his people, the Israelites, to the point where they say, we need the help of God. We need God's help. And so often in life, we can walk through life, we can walk through our days, we can see events transpire, and we can see how events unfold as well. And we can live with the type of demeanor that says, regardless of what happens, we don't need the help of God. We don't need God to help in our lives. We don't need God to help in our career. We don't need God to, it even can get to the point where we say, we don't need God to help in our church life. We know how to do this church stuff ourselves. We know how, to find volunteers for the nursery, and we know how to find people to lead worship, and we can do all this church stuff ourselves. And so even when it comes to the spiritual, we get to the point where we say, we know how the routine works. We know how to make everything happen, and the one thing we don't need God to show up. We don't need God to work. We can do all of this ourselves. We don't need your help. And sometimes we say that, but usually it's not overtly. I mean, I doubt any of you say, God, I really don't need your help. You're believers in Christ. You believe that God is all-powerful. You believe that God is all-knowing. You believe that God has everything together. So there's no point in your life where you've probably thought, God, I don't need your help. Yet we subtly say to God, we don't really need you to work. We don't really need your help. We can do this ourselves. We can do this on our own. So in Exodus chapter 1, the passage that we're going to look at, it begins in a very interesting situation in the book of Exodus. Now, of course, Exodus is the second book in the Scripture. You have Genesis, then the book of Exodus. This was written by Moses, and it's recording the events that transpired in the life of Moses as well. And verse 1 says, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. You remember Joseph was in Egypt because his brothers sold him into slavery, or they threw him in the pit, and eventually they were going to sell him in slavery, and then they threw him in the pit to get rid of him. Of course, he was transported to Egypt. He rose in power in Egypt, and so Joseph was in Egypt. His brothers come back, and he forgives his brothers, and they become a part, to some degree, of that community. Then Joseph died, all of his brothers, and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. Now this is a Pharaoh over Egypt. We don't know exactly when the events of the Exodus occur. It's probably either under Ramesses, which would be around 1,200 years before Jesus, or under a guy named Amenhotep. That's a great name, isn't it? And Amenhotep would have lived around 1,500 years or so before Jesus. And so that's when these events are transpiring. It says that he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for the Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves. They made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and in brick, and all kinds of work in the field. In all their work they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and another Puah, "When you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, you shall let her live." But the midwives feared God, did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? Let the male children live." The midwives said to the Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. Because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. The Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Now, chapter 2 goes into the birth of Moses and how Moses' mother hid him and made sure that he survived until he wound up in none other than the Pharaoh's house. And we'll look at those events next week. But in chapter 1, you have the Israelites, the Hebrew children. God has worked in very strong ways in their lives. And now God is almost bringing them to the point through these events that are taking place where they realize again that they need God to show up and they need the help of the Lord. And it's amazing how events transpire, how God maneuvers events, how God turns events around, and how God directs the course of life as well as the course of history to the point where eventually, regardless if we think that we're going to, eventually we realize that we need God to show up in a dramatic way. And you may be to that point in your life where you're thinking to yourself, you look at maybe your vocation, you look at your career, you look at events that are happening in your family, you look at events that are even happening in our nation, you look at the world as a whole, and you say that you really would like for God to show up. You would like for God to show up to give you peace. Or you'd like for God to show up to bring joy back into your life. You would like for God to show up in a dramatic way and to redirect the course of events that are currently taking place in your life and to send you in a different direction. But you're at the point where you're saying to yourself, you really want God to show up. You want God to show up in a real, a tangible way. You want God to show up so you can sense His presence and you can know His presence as well. And so over the next several weeks, we're going to be talking about this idea of God showing up or when God shows up. And I believe that deep down, there's this idea that we all want to know the presence of God. We all want to feel the presence of God. We want to pursue the presence of God, but we want God working in our lives. I mean, we don't want some religion that isn't tangible in a real way. We don't want a religion that is fake or a religion that is sort of fluffy and false. We want a religion that's sincere and that's genuine. And you wouldn't be here probably unless somebody brought you here or drug you out of bed and made you come here. But you probably wouldn't be here if there wasn't something in you that longed for experiencing God's presence. And you read about individuals in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well. And you see how they walked with God, how they lived with God, how God came through in their lives in very real ways. And there is a sense in which we want to see that happen. We want to walk with God. We want to personally experience the presence of God. We want to encounter God. We want to know God. And we see that happen in the life of Moses and the life of the Israelites as well. And what's taking place in Exodus chapter 1 is that God is setting them up so that they will one day be able to experience His presence. And for some of you this morning, in your life right now, God is setting you up. God is setting you up in a way that one day you're going to be able to experience His presence. That may not be now. It may not be in this particular moment. This moment may look more like the Israelites in slavery among the Egyptians than it looks like the other events that are going to take place in the book of Exodus. And what you see, the first idea about how God is maneuvering these events, how God is setting us up in order for us to see His presence, is that God preserves us until we realize we need His help. Now, I begin with that idea. We need the help of God. If you want to see God's presence in your life, if you want to see God working in your life, you begin by realizing you need His help. That you actually need God. You're dependent upon God. We can say a lot of grandiose things about God. God is the author of life. God is the author of salvation. You know, God created all things. He threw the stars into the existence. He formed the sky above us. He formed all the animals around us and the sea creatures as well. And God is the author of all this. And the Bible says not only that, but God sustains His creation. He made His creation and He sustains it. And what I mean by He sustains His creation is this. Every breath that you take is directly related to and given by the work of the Almighty God. Now, that means that God, not in a way that's just sort of Eastern philosophy. Eastern philosophy says that God is in the creation in the sense that the creation is combined with God. You can look it up later. It's a word called panentheism. It sounds like a really great word that you can discuss over lunch today, doesn't it? If you don't get anything else from this sermon, you can get that word from this sermon. I won't even charge you for that one. So you can look that up, but it's the idea that God just saturates everything and everything's a part of God and God's a part of everything else. And the Bible doesn't say that about God. It says that God created everything but it says that he's also above his creation, but he's the one who sustains it. And there's a sense in which we get to the point where we realize that we need the help of God. Because, one thing's for sure in life, we're pretty high on ourselves as individuals sometimes, aren't we? Sometimes we struggle with self-esteem or self-worth, or we struggle with having confidence in life. But other times, we're pretty high on ourselves. We think that we can do anything we want to do, any way that we want to do it, and accomplish just what's in front of us. And we have a great picture of how we really don't need God to help us, or we really don't need to depend on the Lord. We think that we're big stuff. And, the Bible says that pride comes before what? You familiar with that verse? It says pride comes before a fall. So we think that we're big stuff. And you know what? When we think that we're big stuff, we're setting ourselves up to what? To fall. Because pride comes before a fall. And God is setting the Israelites up to realize that they need His help, and only His help, or they're going to be in a lot of trouble. I'll tell you what, when they got to the Red Sea, and they're standing at the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh and all of his armies are charging in, they realized that they weren't that big stuff, didn't they? They realized that they weren't all that great, and they couldn't overthrow the Pharaoh and all of his chariots and all of his army. They realized at that point that they needed the help of God. And there's this question of when do we realize that we need God's help? We begin, again, with this idea of believing that we are pretty big stuff, and we're self-reliant. We can do most things ourselves. One of my favorite stories that I've read is by a guy named Chan Galley. He was the football coach at Georgia Tech. Before he was a football coach at Georgia Tech, he was at Alabama's Troy State, which is a smaller college. And so he was playing on a national championship, and he wrote these words down and spoke these words as well. He said the week before the big game, he was headed to the practice field when his secretary called and said, "You have a message, I want you to come and answer it." Galley was very frustrated that he was being interrupted from his practice, especially before the national championship, and he said, "I don't have time to take this call." And the secretary said, "Well, this one's from Sports Illustrated, so maybe you want to come and take this call." Well, Coach Chan Galley thought to himself, well, this is from Sports Illustrated. I better go and take this call. And so he's walking back to his office, and he's thinking to himself about how he has worked within Troy State and how he's brought about some victory in this smaller school. And so he's picturing what this is going to be like when he gets to the phone and talks about the events. He's thinking to himself, they're going to probably not need a one-page story for everything going on. They're going to need a 2 or 3-page story for this. And he's thinking to himself, they're going to have to take some photos and some pictures of everything going on. And what do I do in the photo? Do I need an action shot in this photo? Or do I just want to stand and look robust and look strong? And so he's continuing to walk to the office, and he's thinking to himself, this is going to be probably one of the greatest stories that Sports Illustrated has ever covered. I may even make the cover page of this. This is going to be a big story. So Chan Galley is telling himself all of these things, and so he gets in the office and he says, "Give me the phone. I need to talk to them immediately." He picks up the phone. He says, "Hi, this is Chan. What can I do for you?" And the lady says, "This is Sports Illustrated. We're calling to let you know that your subscription is about to expire. And we want to know if you would like to renew your subscription." Well, that's not the story he wanted. There wasn't the cover shot. There wasn't the action pose. There wasn't everything going on. And Chan Galley says, you are either going to be humbled or you are humble. You're either going to be humbled or you are humble. You're either going to set yourself up to see the presence of God working in your life. You're going to set yourself up to see that God's going to show up in a real way, or you're going to set yourself up in a way that resists God and says that you do not need the presence of God working in your life. And this is exactly what God is doing in this passage. He's showing them that they need His presence. And what you see among this is that even though He's showing them that they need His presence, that God preserves His people in a very dramatic way, and God preserves His people because He gave them a purpose. He said that to Abraham, your descendants will be of the sand of the seashore. God gave them a purpose. God gave the Israelites a purpose. And he was not going to leave them alone. And God's given all of you a purpose. And what's amazing about God, I want you to listen to me very closely. What's amazing about God is that when God gives you a purpose, and secondly, you see here, God gives them a promise as well. I'll show you that in a minute. But when God gives you a purpose, when God gives you a promise, you can run as much as you want. You can resist it as much as you want. You can head in the opposite direction. But God's going to get you where He wants you to be, regardless if you like it or not. And God's going to preserve you. You know what God does? God preserves us through our stupidity and our ignorance until we wind up seeing that we need His help. Let me tell you, don't be at that moment in that place right now. Go ahead and give it up and say, God, I need your help. God, I need you to work. And the Israelites, they begin to make bad choices and bad decisions. Even when they see the hand of God working, they say, we'd be better off back in Egypt as slaves. Even when they see the work of the Lord. You know, you picture Jonah as well. Jonah's a prophet. God said, go preach to the Ninevites. You know, the reason that Jonah didn't preach to the Ninevites is not because he was lazy. It's not because that he was just arrogant, and it's not because that he didn't have enough resources. He didn't like the Ninevites, and he wanted them all to be destroyed. He just didn't like those people, and so he ran in the opposite direction. God got him exactly where he wanted him to be, and God took him to the Ninevites, and Jonah didn't even like it. You know, the Ninevites were converted, and many of them repented, and Jonah didn't like it. He could not stand that. He couldn't stand that God was moving and that God was working. And he ultimately realized that he needed the hand of God. But you know what? God preserved Jonah through his stupidity. And God preserved Jonah through his dumb decisions. And there's some of us right now this morning that God is preserving you even though you're making bad decisions. God is preserving you even though you're running in the opposite direction. And you need to get to the point where you say, I need the help of God. So God gave them a purpose. God also gave them a promise. You know, I love this verse. It's a very different verse. Let me get back to the Exodus chapter 1. You just see how God has given them this promise and how God is working as well. It says, there arose a new king over Egypt. He did not know Joseph. He didn't like Joseph. And he said, you know, let's destroy them. They set taskmasters over them. And it says in verse 12, but the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. That's how God preserves a promise. The more outward opposition, the more attacks that maybe the evil one brings your way to take you in the direction that God doesn't want you to go, the more God is working. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied as well. And then you see this verse on down. It's kind of an amazing verse. It talks about the birth of the children. And it says, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this? Why are the male children still living? The midwives said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. I don't even know if I understand this verse or not. It says, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. That means that God was doing something that I don't exactly get. But God was preserving these babies and preserving these children. And God was at work. You see, there's this great oppression. There are these great attacks. And yet God has given them a purpose. And God has given them a promise. And you can stop everything else in your life. You can stop everything else going on. You can have outward attack. You can have outward opposition. You can have everything against you. But if God has given you this promise and God has given you this purpose, He's going to fulfill it. He's going to bring it through. He's going to see it come to pass as well. And so God's presence is here to preserve us until we realize we need His help. Secondly, now I want you to listen to this carefully as well. I think this is a great point. I wrote it down, and if I didn't think it was a great point, I wouldn't have written it down. Now, there are those Sundays when I feel like I don't have anything to preach. That's not this morning, so you can go home feeling good about this service. Now, listen. We have to realize we need God's help. Now, listen to this. We have to realize we need God's help before we're ready for the burning bush or the Exodus experience. Now think through that. They weren't ready for the Exodus experience. They weren't ready for the burning bush. Moses was not ready for the burning bush. God sent Moses to a desert after he killed one of the Egyptians and made him wait around there, not doing a lot probably, until he was ready for the burning bush experience, until he was ready to meet God. And there's this sense in which to say, okay, God, show up, show me your purpose, show me your promise, show me what you want me to do. And God says, you're not ready yet. You're not ready for the burning bush experience. You're not ready for the Exodus event. And God is leading all of these events to the point where he has us where he wants us to be, and where we're ready to actually experience the presence and the power of God in our lives. And you may not be ready for that right now, and you need to realize until you're ready for that, God's still preserving you. God hasn't given up. But God is bringing you to his purpose, and God is bringing about his promise as well, regardless if you feel like you're ready. Now, Exodus chapter 1, what you see here is the obstacles. They do become events that create change in the lives of the people. And I just want you to see in Exodus chapter 1, beginning with the first section, this is how God sets up his people to be ready for everything that he's going to do. This is how God sets up his people to show his real presence. It says in verse 1, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. Now he lists the names. Verse 5 says, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. 70 persons, okay? Perfect number. God promised the sand of the seashore, and they would multiply the descendants. This is how God is preparing his people, though. If you go later in Matthew chapter 1 and look at the way the gospel writer sets this up, we have a promise in Matthew chapter 1. Now, Matthew chapter 1, Jesus is born. He's coming on the scene. And, you think about the events of Matthew, what happens when Jesus is being born, when the promise is about to be fulfilled? Well, King Herod goes and he wants to kill all the babies. Sounds like the book of Exodus, doesn't it? And in Matthew chapter 1, beginning with the first verse, you have a recording of the genealogy. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Okay? Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah. You go on through the list. It says, verse number 6 at the end, it says, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, the Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah. You keep going down. Verse 9, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz. Verse 10, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh. Verse number 11, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. Okay, we're tracing a list here. And on down it says in verse 17, so all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation to Babylon to Christ, 14 generations. So we're tracing these generations, and they're circling around numbers. And the numbers they're circling around leads us back to the book of Exodus to show us that there's an event that's taking place. Now, Matthew chapter 1 through the ending of Matthew chapter 28 is set up to say that Jesus is the new Moses, that Jesus is the one who is leading a new Exodus, but this Exodus isn't out of Egypt, it's an Exodus out of our sin and out of our slavery and bondage to self, and he's leading his people with a promise. And so what you have in Matthew chapter 1 is that all the events are being set up. The evil, Herod killing the babies, all the events are being set up so that God can bring about his promises, so that God can bring about his plans, so that God can work his purposes to show his presence. Because in the book of Matthew, you have the direct, incarnate, fleshly presence of God in the person of Jesus Christ. And the same way, in the book of Exodus, God is maneuvering all events. God is maneuvering all the things in your life as well to set you up so that he can show his dramatic, powerful, awe-inspiring presence in your life. And so there's this idea of encountering the Lord. And that may not be you this morning. I mean, you may have woke up this morning and you're looking in the mirror and you're thinking to yourself, I can't go on with another day. Or you're looking in the mirror and you're thinking to yourself, I'm ready to give up. I'm ready just to give in. I have too much pressure from work, too much pressure from my family, too much pressure from my friends. I look around and the world is a disaster. And so you may be looking in the mirror and thinking, I look like a disaster, And you're thinking to yourself, I'm just ready to throw in the towel. I'm ready to give up. And what you need to realize is this. As soon as you get to that point, there's only one person you need to help you. Who is that? It is God. And God has you exactly where He wants you to be. When you realize that your only way out of the bad situation, when your only way to move forward, when your only way to change your life is going to depend upon Him and Him alone, then He's got you where He wants you. And God's about to show up. Would you stand with me this morning? Father, in these moments as we sing,